Hey, welcome to the Cooperant Learning Podcast. I'm so excited you're here. This is our first episode. We're doing a subject matter expert series on rights, ethics, and behavior analysis when it comes to providing services in adult populations. We had a live audience in there with us from the Sparks Behavioral Services team. Let me tell you a little bit about Sparks Behavioral Services. We are a team of behavior analysts serving the state of Michigan, providing behavioral science to improve the lives of people we work with, regardless of the nature or severity of their needs. Sparks BCBAs enjoy the opportunity to work in a variety of settings, including adult foster care homes, adult residential placements, and group homes. And we're always looking to add members to our team. So if you're a passionate BCBA or behavior technician and you're interested in learning more, please check us out at sparksbehavioralservices.com. And with that, enjoy our first episode. And we're talking about assent today, and who better to join us for this inaugural episode than someone who has a lot of incredible insight on this topic. I'll do a little introduction here. He's the Assistant Professor, Graduate Programs Director of Behavior Analysis, and Chair of the IRB at Salve Regina University. As a researcher, he's focused on several topics, including client involvement in therapeutic decisions, assessment and treatment strategies for challenging behavior, and organizational practices. And he currently serves as the editorial board member for the journals Behavior Analysis and Practice, Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. He's the director of the executive board for the Rhode Island Association for Behavior Analysis and the executive producer and host of the Behavior Analysis in Practice, the podcast. This is Dr. Cody Morris. Thanks so much for being here.
Hey, excited to be here. Appreciate it. And excited to connect with some Midwesterners. I know there's probably people joining us from all over the place, but anytime I get a chance to chat with people from Michigan or the area, I'm excited to do so.
I was going to say, you've got some fellow Western grads here joining live
That's
with us
right.
today. So.
Go Broncos as well.
I had never really looked at the Salve Regina campus before, but holy cow, it looks beautiful out there right now.
Yeah, I'm very fortunate to be here. It's a beautiful campus. We're right on the Atlantic Ocean, so you can see behind me our campus is built in Gilded Age mansions, and so you can see a beautiful home behind me that is now part of our campus. And if I lean far enough back in my seat, I can actually see the ocean. So pretty happy to be here.
Very cool. That's amazing. We'll go ahead and get started. Like I said, the topic is assent. Audience live with us. Just utilize that hand raise function if you want to participate either with a question or a comment. If you don't want to use your voice, feel free to pop in the chat and I'll kind of moderate as topics come up, okay? So first things first, I thought we'd just land on a definition of assent. So how do you define assent? Differentiating that from consent, which most of us are probably more familiar with, and what kind of led to your interest in that topic?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So I guess to start with consent, I think most people are all familiar with it, but to sort of have a basis of that conversation, I think it's important to define that. So consent is typically defined as the affirmation of an individual who has legal authorization to do so is providing permission for themselves or other people who they might be a guardian of to participate in a procedure after they've received adequate information about that procedure. Assent is similar. It's an affirmation that an individual is agreeing to participate in research, but the distinction is that it's the person who's providing that affirmation is not legally authorized to provide their own consent. So that could be a child, that could be an adult who's in some sort of conservatorship of some sort, be it because of their developmental disabilities or severe mental illness or whatever that might be. And so that's sort of our basis, our foundational sort of understanding of what assent is. To be a little bit more specific in terms of assent, I typically define it as a client who cannot legally consent for themselves, indicating their willingness to participate in a procedure via a choice arrangement. It has to be presented to them as a choice after they've received adequate information about the procedure, with the expectation that they can withdraw their assent at any time. And of course, there are several components. We can unpack that if you'd like, but That's the general definition I use.
Yeah, I think it'd be great to unpack that. I was curious though, was there any certain events or any history there with your interaction, in clinical work that kind of led to an interest in that, in writing about it and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm speaking to a group of folks in the adult world in Michigan, and that's sort of where my interest began. So, within my first couple of weeks getting clinical experience as I was beginning graduate school, I was asked to go out to a group home to attend a treatment team meeting that was being organized for one of my clients who's an adult with developmental disabilities. And, I'm relatively new to that world. I'd had experience with folks with developmental disabilities in like a summer camp context, and then, little experiences here and there. But this is my first real experience in the adult world. I go out to this home. My client had a court-appointed guardian who had not attended the meeting, but apparently had seen the treatment plan prior and consented to it. And the social worker was out at the group home, sort of leading the conversation. This is for a treatment plan, which is distinct from a behavior support plan. So this is a plan that the social worker had ultimately written. And I don't remember how many pages it was, but it was a sort of a thick pack of papers that included several components. When we sat down for the meeting, the social worker probably spent less than 3 minutes summarizing everything in that packet, slid it over to the client, gave them a pen. The client scribbled their on a line on the packet. The social worker removed the packet, and then the client proceeded to scribble on, napkins and stuff that were laying around the table. And social worker, cool, we've got the consent from the guardian, we've got assent from this client, we're good to go. And I thought, I'm new to this, but that doesn't seem quite right. At least it seems like there could be a much, much better way of doing this, and much more opportunities to involve our clients more meaningfully in these conversations that's important related to their treatment. So that sort of got me initially interested in the topic. And as a history geek, I started exploring it from sort of several angles, looking at it from really what's the history of assent and involvement in therapeutic decisions and behavior analysis. What about in developmental disabilities and mental illness broadly? And I've sort of looked at it from several angles since then.
Gotcha. Yeah, that is a wild story. Probably not too unfamiliar of stories that we've all similarly seen before as well. So yeah, unfortunately, that's part of things. Sometimes it feels like. But yeah, that seems like, it seems like that would be a big eye-opening experience. And so you've written a lot about this topic. I thought, you said you could maybe unpack a little bit more about assent. So you talked about some critical components of assent. If you want to dive into those and kind of talk about what it looks like on a practical level in client involvement.
Yeah, for sure. So when we sort of hone in specifically on assent and we think about that definition I just provided, the practitioners out there might be starting to kind of think, okay, which aspects of those definition are kind of feasible and with the type of clients I'm working with? What are the components I may struggle with? Ultimately, how do I apply this in practice? And so I think there's sort of several layers of consideration. You've got to think about the applicability of assent in any given situation. The reality is there are going to be times where assent is absolutely essential to a meaningful therapeutic practice. There are going to be times where assent should not be prioritized for several reasons. You've got to think about the skill set that the client has related to being able to assent or dissent or withdraw their assent. You've got to think about the procedures you're using to assess assent. The reality is the sort of standard assent assessment process is typically either arranging for a spoken or written agreement to participate in whatever procedures, which is obviously going to exclude anyone who has any sort of significant communication difficulties, which may not be a necessary exclusion. There are ways of arranging assent in a more adapted sort of arrangement that can be accessible to folks that don't have robust communication repertoires. You have to think about the way that you're arranging assent so that the choice is ultimately a fair choice. You've got to think about when you're arranging opportunities. There are countless decisions being made in a client's everyday experience, and you cannot simply stop and assess for assent at every moment of every day. And then, you have to consider whether informal assessments of assent are useful or if you only sticking to formal assessments. Again, it's sort of an overview of some of those topics. Happy to dive into any you find more or less interesting.
Yeah, I would maybe be interested in hearing more on the assessment of assent. One, I mean, it's been a couple of years now. That wasn't really part of my education as far as what in behavior analysis, how to assess for assent. And like you said, typical methods of getting assent might not be super applicable to some of our clients. So, how do you teach? I hate a lot of times I see on some of those behavior plans, non-compliance being targeted, but that's kind of what we want to see more of, right? Is some non-compliance because we want people to be able to, stick up for themselves or stand up for themselves when faced with maybe aversive or some sort of scenario that they don't want to have happen. So I guess what are some of those methods of assessing, and how do you prioritize teaching when it falls in line with the rest of a treatment package?
Sure. So I think there's two things you sort of hit on there. One is sort of this idea of this formal assessment of assent, and the other is the identification of assent withdrawal, which are actually two separate processes. Both are extremely important, but essentially need to be understood separately. On the identification of assent, like the sort of the first part of the process, right? Once you're providing someone the choice to assent or dissent, there's a few pieces that are critical in that arrangement. Typically, these pieces are embedded within a written assent arrangement or a spoken assent arrangement, but they don't necessarily have to be. And these four components that I'm going to describe were originally described by the American Academy of Pediatrics, who have been interested in assent for decades now, have been doing very meaningful work around assent for that period of time. And so when I was becoming interested in assent, looking to see what previous behavior analysts have done, I also wanted to see what the rest of the world is doing related to assent, right? We're not the only ones working with these populations. We're not the only ones working with populations that have guardians who can't consent for themselves. And so I wanted to see what other folks were doing, and really pleasantly surprised to find the great work that the American Academy of Pediatrics have been doing. And so they describe sort of four critical pieces of assent that is sort of widely understood in American medicine. And when I found those components, they didn't quite translate to sort of behavior analytic jargon. And so I'm going to sort of describe the translated version of the American Academy of Pediatrics' four components of assent. That's ultimately that the client has to be acquainted with the treatment options. They have to be aware of the treatment options in some way. There have to be discriminative stimuli signaling each of the treatment options. Essentially, there has to be a response option to indicate which one they're choosing. You have to test and confirm whether those discriminative stimuli have stimulus control over those options. meaning that those response options, the things that they're going to indicate they want to do, actually correspond to the things that they're trying to do.
Sure.
And you have to arrange the choice. You have to facilitate the actual arrangement of the different options. In terms of the arrangement or the identification of assent withdrawal, that's also critically important in this arrangement. It's critical that assent withdrawal not be taken as an indication that a client is assenting. So a lot of folks, when they're interested in assent, go, okay, like let's start looking at for assent withdrawal. And if we don't see any assent withdrawal, then we can assume that there's assent. There's a big problem with that. And in fact, this is something that's been talked about outside of behavior analysis and is actually included in like federal documents and guidelines related to assent for research. In that the lack of assent withdrawal cannot indicate assent. And the reason being is that, you know, clients can have a history of being reinforced or required to more or less engage in blind compliance. There can be all sorts of issues that might prevent someone from actively withdrawing their assent. And so we can't assume that to mean assent. In terms of identifying specific behaviors that might be an indication of assent withdrawal, you had commented on or mentioned the idea of like non-compliance or other sorts of behaviors that may indicate that, which could be useful to identify. The catch is there are often sort of ambivalent or ambiguous behaviors that a client can engage in that the staff or the folks that are providing services to them might learn to mean certain things, right? So, you know, when my client pulls back from the table, that might mean that, hey, they're done. Like they need a break, right? And good clinicians often identify those really idiosyncratic forms of sort of assent withdrawal or whatever that might be. Right. So I've had clients or I've had organizations that I've worked with serving clients say like, hey, for this client, we know when like he jerks his head back and takes a deep breath, like he's done. Like that's his like I'm out of here sort of precursor. And that's amazing that folks are able to identify that level of sort of idiosyncratic behavior. That's amazing. But it's ambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be complicated to arrange treatment in a way where everyone involved with the treatment is going to know, like, oh, when this client leans his head back and takes a deep breath, that means that he's, you know, withdrawing his assent or he needs a break or whatever that might mean. And so one of the things I always talk about when being intentional about assent is first of all, identifying those idiosyncratic responses and honoring those. That's amazing. That's great work. But also helping our clients learn very direct, clear assent withdrawal responses so that you're not reliant on the direct care staff who's never worked with this client knowing that when they blink their eye twice and pull on the ear that they're done for the day.
Right. Yeah. And I definitely had experiences like that where I'm new to the home and, you know, all of a sudden everybody kind of gears up and I'm not responding to that SD because I've never had that experience before. And, you know, oh, you know, he blinked his eyes twice, like he said. I think I've got a hand raised. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, I would think even on that, I mean, you should do some sort of functional assessment into what those behaviors are, because it could be a completely different competing or concurrent contingency and have nothing to do with assent in the moment. But, you know, there's momentary MO for some other reinforcement that people may pick up on and think, oh, you know, we should stop because they're withdrawing assent at this time.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I've seen some folks who have sort of been pushing this idea that any sort of non-compliance or disruptive behavior should always be taken as assent withdrawal. And to Steve's point, that's a very dangerous game to play, because a client could be engaging in those behaviors for any reason. It could be because they want the therapist attention, right? And maybe they want like that little kind of deviant interaction, like goofing around. That doesn't mean that they don't want to participate in the procedures. And so, the reality is we have decades of research showing that disruptive behaviors occur for all sorts of reasons, right? It's all sorts of research on identifying the function and strategies to do that. So we don't want to take any specific topography of a behavior and assume that means anything, even if it is more, seriously disruptive or anything. We don't know that means that they're withdrawing from treatment. We need to do assessments to confirm its function. And if it is, in fact, the way of the client communicating that they want to be done with a specific procedure or experience, cool. Now let's actually train them in some functional communication or other specific, clearer, less ambiguous forms of communication to specify exactly, what they're hoping to achieve.
So my next question is to that point. So assent has now been withdrawn. So what's next? What do we do as clinicians? What do we train staff to do? Is it idiosyncratic based on the individual? How do you go about telling people, hey, this person has communicated they don't want to participate. Now what?
So it's a great question. And I think to an extent, it depends on the nature of your assent assessment. The reality is assent is a dynamic process. Assent is not meant to be something that occurs at the beginning of the therapeutic relationship, and that's that. And then, either that you get it or you don't get it. And if you don't get it, then you walk away and you're done forever, or you get it and then anything you want to do with the client moving forward is good because they've agreed to it. That's not really the way it works. It has to be an ongoing process. I remember, to sort of speak to some experiences that are sort of familiar to your guys' world. I was consulting for group homes. I had a client who had a referral to work with a client who was an older woman who had not bathed in 6 months, I think. And making matters more complicated, she had continence issues. So she had, feces and urine on her body, and the staff really couldn't clean it up. And so we get the referral to work with her. I go to the home to meet the client for the first time. This client was her own guardian, actually. I go to meet the client with the social worker, and the social worker introduces me, and I'm not kidding. She says, "Hey, this is Cody. This is the guy that's going to make you shower."
Yep.
You might guess that client was not particularly keen on interacting with me or interested in my services, right? For very good reason. And so she literally was like screaming at me, "Get out. I'm not talking to you." Yep, fair enough. I get it. But so then the next phase was, okay, like I left the house. She doesn't want to have the interactions. I came back by the home a week or so later. Hey, can I just like sit with you and chat with you? And hey, also, by the way, I brought some licorice, which I know is your favorite treat. Like, can we just like eat some licorice and chat? Right. And then so we started on that process, building a little rapport. I got to know her goals of what she was hoping to achieve and not my treatment, but just treatment overall in her group home setting, and really just kind of built that rapport and sort of tied ultimately what was the consent process into the larger concept, which I think is client involvement in therapeutic decisions. And so once I was talking with her about like, what are your goals? Because the treatment team that had ultimately sought my consultation, their goals were to get the client to shower. Right. Which is, fair enough. It's important from a health and safety standpoint. My job in this particular case was to understand the client's goals. What are you hoping to achieve? And do your goals hopefully align in any way with the goals of the treatment team, which is this showering thing? And after hearing about the client's perspective and understanding her goals, I was able to kind of help her understand how the showering actually connected to her goals, and that we could sort of systematically work our way toward that behavior. And so when you're navigating situations where clients aren't willing to engage in the procedures, be it via assent or consent, I think step one is understanding why. And step two is figuring out how you can change the therapeutic dynamic to better align with what the client actually does prefer or want, be it understanding their goals, understanding the things that they prefer, that they find reinforcing, and adjusting the process to better align with those things. I talk about assent as sort of a component of this idea of client involvement in therapeutic decisions. I would also include social validity, indices of happiness, client initiation, treatment goals. All of those things are distinct. They're not one and the same. They're all different components. They're all ways of getting a client involved in therapeutic decisions. They're all meaningful, but they don't mean the same thing. But I think they all work together. And where you're maybe struggling with one piece like assent or consent, I think it's important to open it up and go, okay, like, how do we understand what the client's goals are? How do we understand the things that make them happy? How do we understand whether this is a valid, socially valid procedure that we're trying to do in the first place from the client's perspective or not?
Is that what they mean by balancing that dignity of risk and duty of care? Is that kind of falling into that definition, or?
Yeah, that does tie in, because another piece of all of this is if we're aiming to provide meaningful services to a client, to do that, I think we have to have effective treatment, right? And that ultimately is informed by the client's preferences and really centered around what's best for the client. There are going to be situations where a client may not prefer or want to necessarily engage in a treatment that is necessary for their welfare. The example I often give of this is getting a blood draw, right? And if we just use a child for an example for a moment, how many 4-year-olds in the world are gonna agree to getting their blood drawn, even if you're like, hey, but don't you, like, you've got this medical issue going on, we need to get this hematology report, we need to understand what's going on. You can give them all the rationale in the world. Most 4-year-olds aren't going to be psyched to get their blood drawn. And that's also true for most adults. Most of us aren't going to be psyched. A lot of us have the skills necessary to be able to cope in those situations. If you've got a developmental disability, a mental illness, you may not have those skills. Nevertheless, things like blood draws or life-saving medications. I've worked with several clients that have seizure disorders and have to take certain medications. If they don't, they're at risk of, fatal seizures. Those types of things aren't necessarily optional. And so part of sort of this therapeutic decision-making process is understanding when the client preference for treatment options should be prioritized over what is ultimately effective treatment, or vice versa. And the reality is sometimes we have to choose treatment options that the client may not want to necessarily engage in the moment, but are necessary for their well-being. The trick there is you cannot justify everything you want to do to a client going, this is necessary for their well-being. It has to truly be necessary for their well-being. And I think that concept has been abused in several treatments. Like, yeah, this is like best for the client, right? It's they've got to wear this shirt today and they don't want to wear that shirt today. They want to wear a different shirt. But now the yellow shirt, that's best for their treatments. Like that, you can't justify that kind of stuff. It truly has to be something that's like necessary for their health, safety, and well-being.
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, as I was, hearing you talk about this, and it really sounds like, we're either shaping behavior, the verbal behavior involved in the assent process, or providing competing contingencies, reinforcement on top to show, these are things that are important that we need to work on. But, here you talk about our 3-year-old, and we'll go get a cupcake after. We just got to get these shots first. You know what I mean? And obviously we wouldn't do that with the adult consumers with, severe self-injurious behavior, something along those lines. But where do you think that line is for, I guess, kind of shaping the assent process? Is it a social validity question where, we're reinforcing the assent to the point where now it's not about the process or someone's own, verbal behavior belief, but we're actually changing that verbal behavior or belief to fit what we want? It almost seems like there's a line there that can be crossed that we may not know where that line exists,
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And yeah, I do ultimately think it comes down to assessing the social validity of the treatment or the context or whatever it might be. And the reality is that is going to require a little bit of clinical judgment, right? Because it's like, where is that line? I've got to make some individualized decisions about it. But I do think that clinicians can lean on the input from the client, the input from their community, be it if we're talking adults in group homes, like their group home, their home managers, their family members, if they're involved. You can always take input from like advocates in that community, be it if it's like, working with someone diagnosed with autism, the sort of autistic community, like what are they generally had to say about these types of procedures and these types of behaviors and how do they weigh out? And, I had a client that I was referred to work with, adult living in a group home, who was originally referred to work with me for like food refusal. She was refusing to eat really any meals other than a very specific like fast food meal. Like she just kind of always demanded you gotta have this meal from McDonald's or whatever it was. Refused to eat anything else. I went through the assessment and treatment process with her. Came up with a successful treatment, started eating meals at the home. She was still getting her McDonald's here and there, but she was also eating other meals at the home. And the group home staff were like, cool, now we want you to get her to stop like swearing. And I'm like, well, tell me more, like, help me understand. What are you talking about? I don't understand. What do you mean stop swearing? Like, occasionally she'll say like, she'll say swears. She'll say, I guess I won't say because this is like a podcast and I don't know how you're trying to disseminate it, but
we don't know yet either, but
yeah, she'll drop the S word or like the A word. And it's like, she's an adult. She's allowed to swear. Like, I'm not going to, if she's threatening people or engaging in behaviors that are dangerous in any way related to her spoken communication, yeah, I'll take that on. But an adult living at home is allowed to swear. I'm not gonna like police this person's behavior to that extent. That's not normative. That's not appropriate. And so I think it's understanding when you're crossing the line between like, okay, this is like a socially meaningful behavior. This is important for their well-being. I always talk to my students about the goal of behavior analysis really is to help clients gain as much independence and autonomy as possible. And so one of the measures I have for if a behavior is relevant to treatment is, does it help lead to independence and autonomy or not? And if it doesn't, then I don't know that it's relevant to the type of work that I'm doing. And so I think you've got to have sort of multiple layers of consideration when trying to make these decisions. I'm not going to pretend that it's like an easy process. It is a complicated process. It does require input from multiple stakeholders, but I think that is ultimately necessary to provide meaningful treatment.
Nick has a hand up. Go ahead, Nick.
You already answered the question, so it was similar to Steve, so we're good.
Thank you.
So along the lines
go
of
ahead.
the swearing and that sort of thing, sorry, I'm going to act like I still had my hand raised here. And by the way, as part of this podcast process, there's going to be some swearing probably if I'm involved. So just how then do you address like the changes in social validity and how quickly that can happen, with the social norms? Because for those that don't know, Cody and I was part of that team he was talking about, for a brief period of time back 12, 13 years ago. Looking at now, I probably shouldn't have mentioned how long ago it's been, but if you talk about swearing maybe back 100 years ago, maybe that would have been a much bigger deal than it is now compared to, a dozen years ago, the things that we were asked to do or requested to do. Sure, swearing might have not been high on our list. We'd have said, that's kind of a normal thing, but some of the other things we might have addressed then, now it's kind of like, no, this is this person's right to have these quirks or some of those things that make them them. And it's been a large swing just in the last 10 years even.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Steve. And I think part of the evolution of the treatment for folks with developmental disabilities or severe mental illness or whatever experiences that people are having is the way that society is continuously growing to understand that population, those needs, how they should be treated in society, how they should be incorporated, how some of their behavior should be destigmatized. Like the reality is, behavior analysts are part of the same culture that everyone else is in our society. And I think ultimately what we're responsible to do as behavior analysts is to help our clients as much as possible within the sort of parameters that we're given to work with them. And so the reality is we are captive to whatever the culture sort of deems appropriate, inappropriate, things that are important, things that are not important. We obviously should try to take a wide view of the situation. For example, I've worked with clients in, let's say, a school setting who had a very authoritative teacher, right? And what the teacher wanted for her classroom was like your sort of run-of-the-mill, like sort of drill instructor level discipline in the classroom. By the way, this is like for like 4-year-olds. And so from the teacher's perspective, the goal should be that this child, this 4-year-old, sits at a desk, says, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, all of that for 8 hours a day. And so if I stay at that level of the analysis and go, okay, like what does her immediate sort of culture expect and want? That's realistically a biased view and a warped view, frankly, of what is a beneficial therapeutic arrangement. If I zoom out and I go, okay, well, first of all, what is normative for like 4-year-olds in our culture right now? What is normative for if this client had an autism diagnosis? What is normative for 4-year-olds with autism? What is expected in our society right now? And what is their family input on this? What is the autistic advocacy feedback on this? All I can do is take sort of a preponderance of the evidence that exists to say like what is meaningful, what is not meaningful, and do my best to make the decision. And probably another 50 years, there will be things that people look at going, nah, you shouldn't have been doing that thing. And I think that's just part of the growth. All we can do is the best we can and sort of the moment, and sort of hope that as a society, we do continue to grow and learn and adjust our expectations.
Yeah, my view kind of wasn't, I think, saying the same thing, but you can obviously disagree as you want. But it's almost like, as behavioral scientists, our job is just to use the techniques to do what society is asking of us in the moment. And so while we may individually be members of those societies and communities and have a voice there, when we are, in the scope of a behavior analytic professional, it's almost like, all right, this is what you're telling me we should actually be working on. This is what we're allowed to work on. And these are the techniques we're allowed to use, even though I may have personal feelings about it that don't necessarily match up with that.
Yeah, for sure. I think part of it is understanding, as an individual behavior analyst, we could obviously be bringing our own personal biases. We have to check those at the door and sort of get a temperature check on, well, what does like the community and the larger community really expect and support in this context? And as a practicing applied behavior analyst, we have two things going on. We have the science of behavior analysis, and then we have our ethics, basically, if that's what you want to call it. We know, as scientists, our science will continue to progress. And in 50 years, we'll probably be looking at our assessments and treatments now going, whoa, those were off, and we're doing so much better now. That's what we hope for as a science. I think the same is equally true for ethics, right? I think ethics grows and evolves and changes. And so we look back 50 years ago at sort of the ethical views of certain things, we're like, oh, that was a little off, and I suspect the same will be true in another 50 years. But our job is just to grow and adapt as we get new information about our science and as we get new information about our ethics.
Kind of along those lines, I'm just imagining having a similar conversation with guardians of recipients. And to those unfamiliar with the adult world, guardians obviously play a huge role. They make a lot of important decisions on client behalf. But often we run into situations where client assent and guardian consent contradict, or guardian says, no, this is the way it needs to be done for these reasons, and the client says, no, I want to do it this way. There might not be a clean answer on this, but how do you suggest navigating those situations? I've certainly ran into those. I'm sure this team sees that pretty much on a regular basis. And it has to do with, perceptions of client well-being and the guardian making that decision versus the client deciding what they want their ideal life to look like. And it they just butt heads in these meetings. What do you think of those, navigating those situations?
When I've been in those situations, my strategy has always been to center the conversations about treatment decisions around the goals of treatment. And oftentimes, step one is coming to agreement about what those treatment goals are, right? So I've had situations where guardians have a different idea of treatment than the rest of the treatment team, including the client. So they might be like, I want the client to be a perfect, saint of an angel, basically. And it's like, well, the rest of the team is like, hey, we want them, being a little bit more independent, communicating more independently, engaging in more activities of daily living, getting into the more, right? So we got some more like measurable things around independence and autonomy. While the guardian is like, I just expect them to be, a perfect person. Well, can we get to agreement on what those goals are? Because if we're at disagreement, we're never going to agree on the individual strategies. So like, okay, you want them to be perfect. Like, why do you want them to be perfect? Right? Well, I want them, maybe they have an idea around like, you have to be perfect to have independence and autonomy. And go, well, can we just like focus on that piece? Like, you want them out in the community. And if they care about the client, they're probably going to say yes, right? And say, okay, well, like let's center on that, and let's sort of make our judgments of whether we should do something or not based on that. And once you have that shared goal, then you still might have folks who want to push for certain treatments or interventions or strategies that don't align with those goals for whatever reason, be it that they're like super attached to one specific idea of an intervention, or that they have a sort of warped view of how to get to an end goal. So if you're sort of navigating, okay, like we all agreed that this is the goal. Let's say that it's helping the client get into the community more. We all agree that this is the goal. And maybe the guardian's pushing for something that doesn't really align with that. Question. Like, I think it's a conversation about like that. Like, I don't see how that aligns. Can you help me understand it? Can you help me? And then unpacking that more, or maybe shaping that into something that does align with the goals. But it's just an understanding of like, are we on the same page? Like, are we all aiming for the same end goal? If so, I think it's easier to navigate some of those sort of misdirections and differences in opinion as to how to get there.
Gotcha. Key areas or research that you think, any questions that still need answered about assent? You're the expert here. What do you think?
A lot, I think that the heart of behavior analysis has always been grounded in this idea of sort of client-centered services. And I think, that dates back to Skinner talking about counter control and issues with power differentials and therapeutic arrangements. Beowulf and Risley, when they essentially created the concept of applied behavior analysis in the 7 Dimensions paper, talking about social validity. Montrose Wolf elaborating on social validity, and many other researchers doing that since. We've always sort of had at this idea that to provide meaningful services, they have to be in the best interest of the client. So like we're centering our treatment decisions around the client. And in the process of unpacking and beginning to understand how to do that better is the idea of getting the clients involved with therapeutic decisions as much as possible, right? Because that's how do you know if a client wants something's going to benefit from them? Well, like, what do they have to say about it, right? It's an important strategy in that equation. And so while we've had this sort of, I think, very, very rich history as a field in this idea and this sort of ethos or sort of beliefs around the value of our treatments, specific strategies on how to do that are still wanting. Like we've got a lot of good social validity measures that are help in different contexts, right? There's different measures for different things, but even those aren't covering every situation and every context that you might need them in. Understanding assent and consent, how to apply it, how to adapt it, how to adjust assent procedures based on client profile, right? So let's say that I've got a client who doesn't have strong communication skills, maybe doesn't engage in spoken communication, doesn't respond to written communication. How do you help them orient or acquaint them to the procedures you're going to seek their input on? If you can't simply tell them, right? So one strategy is you can expose them to those procedures, right? So if I want the client to assent to engaging in a token economy, and they don't have spoken communication, well, like how do I arrange that? Well, I might expose them to that token economy. I might, before I assess assent, I might have them go through some of those processes so they see what that procedure is like, right? And then after they become sufficiently acquainted with it, then go, hey, do you want to keep doing this token economy or no? To do that initial exposure requires sort of direct contact with the contingencies, which has to be done through essentially forced exposure. So to even get to assent in some situations, I now have to expose the client to something without their assent. So people are like, oh, that's not great.
Mhm.
Well, the reality is it might enable them to assent. And so, like, yeah, there might be a short-term exposure that they're not assenting to, but it ultimately does enable more independence and autonomy to do that. But there might be other procedures to do that. So there might be strategies between sort of spoken arrangements and like forced exposure arrangements. For example, there's sort of research beginning to look at observational learning. And if clients have certain skills
Cool.
related to observational learning, can I role play with another client or a confederate to show the client, hey, this is what this procedure looks like. Are you cool with it? Right. And so there's like all these questions about refinements to procedures, how assent and consent fit into the full equation. There's a lot to be done. I don't think it's anything that's going to be tied up neat in a package with a bow on it, even within my lifetime, right? I think this is like the science of what we do is going to be a continuously evolving process. I think we've got a lot of good stuff going on right now, but I think the ways to improve what we are currently doing are endless, and so there's just so many opportunities for research in this area.
That's awesome. We've got about 5 minutes. Are there any looming questions or any other chats or hand raises anybody wants to add in before we let Cody back to his beautiful campus over there at Salve?
So I'll throw a wrench in things with not enough time to answer it earlier or give good information.
He's
So
known for this.
Yeah, I do this all the time and make meetings go way too long. So in general, we talked about, someone who doesn't have the verbal capabilities necessarily to assent and how to work on that. And, in our work, since you've done previously as well, there's often, like you said, the guardian or the court order saying, you have to follow the treatment, but we still should try to get some assent. And to be fair, they always have the ability to refuse to work with us on any given day. We just have to keep trying to fit the needs of that court order. But what if we took it as far as, some of our consumers have extremely violent histories, sometimes even murder, and they may come to us with a not guilty by reason of insanity finding, where now the state does not want us to even take assent or consent into consideration. Nope, you just have to do something to try to get this person to change their behavior. And it seems like a line that we have to cross, but also at the same time, we're trying to formulate it in terms of, like you said, the autonomy. How can we get you out of this situation? But, the behavior for them, it's effective. They're achieving reinforcement. And so they oftentimes will say, nope, I don't want to work on that. With not enough time to really discuss it thoroughly, where do you see that falls in on that continuum kind of?
So I think the question becomes, are the procedures that you're doing with the clients necessary as indicated by potentially like a court mandate, a legal standing, whatever that might be? If so, then assent isn't applicable. And there are researchers within the world of pediatrics that say in the situation where you have a necessary procedure that you must do, it is inappropriate to ask for assent, and rather you should explain why you're not seeking assent, apologize, and if you can, seek their involvement in peripheral components of the procedure so that they're still exercising some level of autonomy. For example, you have a client who has to take life-saving seizure medications. Not an option, right? They're, regardless of their situation, they can't refuse. They have to take it. Okay. You've got to take it. Buddy, I'm sorry. I know you don't like taking pills. I don't either. But you have to take it. Now, are there components of that arrangement that we can adjust? Can the client choose what drink they take the pill with? Can they choose the time of day? Can they choose the context? Sometimes they can't. Sometimes the doctors literally are like, you take it at noon, you take it with water, and they're like, okay, if that's what a doctor says, that's what we have to do. Maybe we can choose some stuff to do before and after to at least kind of sweeten the pot a little bit. But, the reality is there are a lot of necessary things that, we have to do regardless of the population we're working with in the adult worlds. That might be health and safety things. In the world of children, there are legal stipulations around educational requirements for kids. If a kid says, hey, I don't want to do math, I say, yeah, me either. But you're in school, you've got to do math. I mean, that is quite literally a legal standing or a legal requirement. So you have to navigate those things. And when you do navigate those, I think the key really is to do it as compassionately as possible and to still maximize independence and autonomy as much as you can within those sort of barriers.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense, and I have a lot more particulars I'd love to throw at everyone just to keep the conversation going, but I know we're running out of time with you here, so maybe next time.
Yeah.
Well, cool. I'll wrap it up then. Cody, thanks so much for being here. This is our first run at this. I thought it went incredibly well, super informative. I learned a lot. Thanks so much for being here. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was fun. It's nice seeing you again, Kyle and Steve and Taylor. It was nice seeing you both. I hope all is well, and hope to connect with you all again soon.
Absolutely. All right, we'll let you go. Thanks again.
Cool.